The best test.
Is it live? Or yeah, testing. Yeah, so this is live, whatever you're saying right now.
Testing mic 2. Anything?
We'll find out in a minute.
Testing mic 1, hopefully.
Okay.
over a few changes to the event plan because the government of Canada wouldn't let Alison on a plane. So she's going to be here later. She finally did get on, but the order of her event is getting reversed. We're having the panel discussion first and then Alison's presentation later. So, what else is there? Disruption policy. If a disruption occurs, we have a few steps that us as volunteers are going to take. We're going to identify the disruptive person or persons and request that they stop. If it continues, they'll be asked to leave. And if they refuse to leave, we will ask campus security to deal with the matter. If none of these are sufficient, then we might have to call the police. But we think it's unlikely that that'll actually happen. So, yeah, Phil. Oh, he just ran away. He's supposed to talk about cafe.
Tell us a joke.
Okay. What kind of overalls? Oh, there we go.
Are they like angry now? Be angry with your city planners and your civil engineers. That downtown, I have never seen a bigger, pardon my French, clusterfuck of design in my life.
So we're not alone.
Come in, come in.
Okay, so I am Jesse Bluketow, the Vice President of the SFUMB, and I will be the host and moderator for the panel discussion. I already went over the disruption policy, so I would like to ask Phil to come up and talk about our sponsor.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm super excited about today's presentation. But before I give a brief description of the charity I represent and the one sponsoring today's event, I want to take a brief moment to recognize the hard work that goes on behind the scenes that made this event possible today. The student team behind the SFUMB is incredible. They're the people with the purple tags, by the way, hanging around their necks. Despite all of their schooling, the heavy course loads, assignments, and exams, they have consistently made time to grow this club, organize these events, and strategize how best to advocate for issues affecting men and boys on SFU campus and in Vancouver's greater community. So, and this is all volunteer work, I just want to let you guys know. So please join me in thanking them with a big round of applause. So my name, again, is Phil Johnson. I'm the president of the Vancouver chapter of the Canadian Association for Equality, or CAFE. Some of you may have heard of it before. CAFE is a registered educational charity that's been active for about 4 years, and it's based in Toronto. Our focus is on gender equality, and at present, the particular inequities that men and boys face in society. What are some of those inequities? Well, these include the lack of resources for male victims of intimate partner violence, high suicide rates, the underachievement of boys in education, circumcision, and many, many more. Our advocacy work consists of advertising campaigns and sponsoring events such as this one on university campuses. And Cafe Vancouver has plans to set up similar clubs at other universities here in British Columbia. Cafe National has branches in nearly every major Canadian city, now including Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, and Edmonton. So one of Cafe's biggest successes was setting up the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, and that started in Toronto. And this is really significant for many reasons, because it's really the first center of its kind. It's an all-purpose hub for the health and welfare of boys, men, fathers, and families in the GTA, in the Toronto area. But we at Vancouver here, we really want to set up one of these centers, and we're going to do that here in Vancouver, and sponsoring the SFUMB and other future university clubs will be an important first step towards doing that. So to get there, though, we need help from people like yourselves. So near the end of the event, we'll be handing out this donation jar here. Any donations you can contribute are really appreciated, and it will help us support our mission of men's advocacy here in Vancouver. There's also, we're going to be handing out a feedback form. There's a new option on there to donate online if you'd like us to follow up with you about that. Funds will go directly to the SFUMB and other local initiatives, helping us continue events like this, expand into other forms of activism, and organize more significant fundraising efforts. So, and if you'd like to get involved as a volunteer, just approach myself or Theron, who will be on the panel today. So thank you for your kind attention, and I will pass it back to Jesse.
Okay, so our schedule is reversed. I mentioned that earlier. We're going to have the panel discussion starting now. If you want to ask questions, we have a mic. And if you would like to ask questions anonymously, we do have an Ask FM, which is ask.fm/SFUAMB. For our listeners on the live stream, you can tweet questions to @SFUAMB with the hashtag SheForHe. Okay, so I'd like to call up, introduce our panelists for today. So I think most of you know Karen. She's the founding member of the Honey Badgers. She's been interviewed on numerous TV stations and to various presentations like newspapers. She's been used as an example of men's rights activism in gender studies courses across Canada as well. Our second Honey Badger here today is Hannah Wallen, author of Breaking the Glasses. And aside from being a founding member of HBR and the managing editor, she's also written for Genderratic and A Voice for Men. And our final panelist today is Theron, SFUMB's president, who has been a contributor to HBR and has also actually been used as examples of MRA activism in gender studies classes across Canada. So I'd like to call them up and take a seat at our panel table.
I'm just going to hog the mic.
I'd just like to say that we decided today that I was going to be a panelist because of Alison and some complications. She was supposed to be a panelist. So I guess I'm a good second.
We're stuck with her.
My apologies.
Is there anything you guys would like to say to start off the panel, or should we jump right into some of the questions we have prepared?
I think we should just jump right in.
Okay. So I guess with the theme of the event, SheForHe, do you feel that it's easier for women to speak up about men's issues, and if so, why? Do you see the success of MIA?
The men's issues.
Men's issues advocacy directly linked to community's ability to increase the number of women in its ranks?
Anybody else want to go first?
You go first.
Okay, it's definitely easier to do this as a woman than it is to do it as a man. I don't know how many men have emailed me and said, I was just surfing YouTube one night, I stumbled across one of your videos. If you had been, and I was even mad when I was listening to it for the first bit, and if you were a guy, I would have just clicked away. I would not have stayed and listened to the whole thing. And after I'd listened to the whole thing, I was like, she's got a point. And then I went looking for more information. And that was just from men. Women tend to, Tom Golden, he's a psychologist, clinical psychologist. He's been studying men's psychology, particularly how they grieve and how they heal for decades. And he's written some very good books. And I would recommend them to anybody. But he said that he'd been working with someone who worked with the homeless, and this man had said something that just really struck him. When a man admits that he needs help, he forfeits his right to it. There seems to be a genuine inability for people to actually look at a man who is asking for help, or look at a man who's telling you that he's suffering, particularly if he's suffering as a man. If he's got cancer, he got hit by a car, or something like that. But when it comes to problems that can be labeled specifically masculine problems or predominantly masculine problems, and they come to you and say, I'm suffering, that a wall comes down. Nobody wants to hear it, and nobody wants to help. And so when that's the reaction from even most men, it really does take a woman to sort of be able to say it in such a way that it doesn't put people off, it doesn't get them angry, it doesn't make them feel threatened. Particularly if a man is acting out in any kind of way that could possibly be construed as aggressive, you know, he's going to be taken the wrong way. Men's rights activists have a reputation, an unearned reputation, as doing things like promoting violence against women and using violent rhetoric and inciting violence, and even we've even been called terrorists. None of those things are true, but they're very easy for people to believe, because it's very easy to believe there's a group of angry men out there who just hate women, and that's the only reason they could be talking about these things, is just because they hate women and they're angry and they're bitter and they don't deserve our sympathy. So when a woman is actually saying these things, it's a little harder for people to dismiss it as just angry, bitter men. And that's probably the biggest reason why women need to be very, very involved in all of this, particularly just in the awareness spreading area of things. So I don't know if you have anything to add?
Yeah. There's also the aspect of it can make something more relatable to women, as in society is more interested in approaching problems and dealing with problems based on how they affect women than based on how they affect men.
Or children.
Or even children. Yeah, women get the long end of the stick when it comes to this, and a lot of times if you're able to discuss how it harms women to be facilitated in dysfunctional behavior, because the law is geared toward helping them without taking into account that there are dysfunctional behaviors that can accompany certain situations like domestic violence. As soon as you are able to start talking about ways that women can be damaged by that facilitated dysfunction, it opens up a door for people to start to understand better the way those situations can be harmful to the family and can be harmful to the community and so on. They don't necessarily notice that if it's just harmful to the man involved who's accused of being violent. It takes women pointing out that when a woman acts out violently, it's still violence, that hitting somebody doesn't become a non-violent act because a woman was angry about something somebody did. When a man says it, he's being a wimp. When a woman says it, she's acknowledging the fact that when women take an action, it's still an action, and that we're responsible for what we do. So it takes that female voice to get people to sort of understand and accept when we talk about women that we're not demonizing women. We're actually promoting an understanding of women, and we're actually treating women like adults.
Yeah, and I just have a last thing to add. Just from my observations, I think that the collective voice of women has a lot of power, a lot more power than the collective voice of men. Now, individual men can have, the voice of an individual man can have a lot more power than any woman, depending on his status, like say male CEO obviously has a lot more, his voice is a lot more power than many women. But the collective voice of women, when they say we need this, society needs to change because it's harming us in this way, we are generally quite responsive because the collective voice of women has quite a bit of power. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So yeah, that's why I think it's important.
I want to add something to that too, because you know, the collective voice of women versus the collective voice of men. I think that men can have a collective voice on a whole host of issues, whether it's you know, politics or the economy or rooting for a sports team even. But when it comes to themselves and sort of their position as men, I think it's extremely hard for men to speak collectively. I think that it may be some sort of psychological block. It has to do, it's been demonstrated that when that women have, you know, if you hold all other variables equal, women have an automatic preference for women as sort of an abstract concept. Men have an automatic out-group preference. So they have stronger feelings of affiliation, stronger positive feelings towards women than they do towards men. And I think that this really interferes with men's ability to kind of group together on issues that affect them in particular as men, and sort of speak with one voice. I think that there will always be this this difference in how women can collectivize their point of view, at least in the short term, to get a job done. And you can see this with what was it? When Canada adopted the Swedish model for prostitution, that push, that lobbying effort, it created some very strange bedfellows. Feminist groups and Christian conservatives, feminist women and Christian conservative women came together in the short term in order to get this bill in front of Parliament. And so we don't seem to have, men don't seem to have that ability to just sort of come together even in the short term to accomplish a goal. They seem to be more liable to side with women, to favor women's points of view. So, yeah.
That actually nicely dovetails into another question about whether one of the ways that women in the movement can help the movement is to get people to pay attention to men talking about their own issues as opposed to simply just talking about those issues. What would you say about that?
Could you repeat that?
Oh, yeah, that another way that women in the men's rights movement can improve the movement is by convincing people to listen to men talking about their own issues as opposed to just talking about the issues themselves.
That's actually an experience I've seen sort of firsthand writing with a voice for men. I can point out articles written by men on a voice for men, and people will read them, that would not read them if they hadn't been pointed to by a woman. They would automatically dismiss the article and its contents without ever looking at it if they got the link just by chance or if they got the link from a man, because it's got a man's name and it's about a man's issue. But as soon as a woman points that out to him and says, this is a description of one of the problems, or this is a man's point of view on an experience that he's had because of these issues, or this is research that explains a bit about this issue, or anything, it's legitimized it for these people, that would not necessarily read it otherwise. It's like giving them permission to treat it as somebody's experiences or somebody's research or somebody's thoughts on the subject, rather than to treat it as something that the enemy handed out, or as whining, or depending on what walk of life they come from. I mean, gender issues advocates that consider themselves to be on the other side of the fence will actually consider things that are written by men from an organization that they have called names because a woman gave them the link. So it makes a big difference. It's a big responsibility, and it's also a real privilege to be able to help some of those voices be heard.
I just wanted to say that anyone who came up through the mythopoetic men's movement would be able to tell you, if 20 men are beating drums in a circle in the forest, will anybody hear them? No. Okay, it really isn't enough for men to get, it's a valuable thing for men to get together and talk about their problems and kind of work it out in themselves. And sometimes what I've noticed is that it's not like when people stumble across my material, they feel like full of hope, right? For, positive change and progress and all of this, right? Because I take a very cynical view of the doability of a great deal of what we're actually trying to accomplish here. I'm a pessimist in terms of how much is actually going to end up getting done or changing. But they do tend to express to me that when they could actually attribute what the problem was, and it's kind of like that show, that Medical Mysteries show or whatever, where even when the person finds out after the 10 years of, all of these undiagnosed crazy symptoms, and they find out after 10 years, they finally find out they're gonna die, right? But at least they know at least they know why, right? And that always seems to give them some sort of closure or some sort of feeling of things settling down inside. They're not as angry anymore. Maybe they're more determined instead to make a difference. But I have heard so many people say, so many men say to me, it's not really that I have any hope, it's just that at least I know what's going on, and I'm not in the dark. I'm not wandering around confused, being poked and prodded by the culture without even knowing why, right? And so I think that can really help, and I think that those, sort of the drum circles in the woods can help for certain types of men who might be into that kind of thing. It really does help to actually be able to talk about these things, but unless there are the issues, if the issues are just in drum circles in the woods, if they're not on the table, right, or on the agenda, then that's really not going to accomplish a whole lot to actually make material improvements in people's lives. They have to actually be addressed on more than just an intellectual or a psychological level or an individual level. They actually have to be addressed at a policy level, a legislative level, at the level of the broader culture. So, yeah, it's very important that women are in the movement to kind of force the issues into the public discourse, because they aren't going to get solved in a drum circle in the woods.
So you mentioned that you're a bit of a cynic with respect to succeeding in these goals. What kind of timeline do you see for achieving some of the goals of the men's movement, and what goals do you think are just unachievable in our for humans?
Okay, I won't presume to put a timeline on things. I will say that sexism is never going to go away. I firmly believe this. I do not believe that we are ever going to have as positive feelings of affiliation for men on average, all other things being held constant, in the abstract sense as we will about women. I think that there are too many biological factors involved, even including what we look like. How we differ in our appearance, everything, right? So I don't think that actual equality across the board, including things like gender sentencing gap, stuff like that, I don't think that's ever going to become a reality. What I'm looking at is how close to equality can we actually manage to get, right? And can we bring some of that women are wonderful effect down? Because, some women are wonderful, other women are pretty horrendous. Just like some men are wonderful and some men are, you know who you are, pretty horrendous. No, you're a sweetie. But yeah, no, it's so I think that we can equalize things to a point. We're never going to get all the way to 100% equality, equal treatment, socially, culturally, the whole bit. Politically, legislatively, it's not going to happen. But we can improve things, and we can improve them quite drastically just through essentially doing what we're doing now. And this is part of that, right? So,
yeah, I think things can get a whole lot better from where we are now. And I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic. I do believe that, for example, legislative changes can happen, at least on paper. How much it affects people's biases in the court system, for example. It'll mitigate that somewhat. I agree with you that it won't ever totally go away, but getting those changes on paper, getting legislation passed that would ensure that just in general men get treated equally where there are biases when it comes to the sentencing gap, when it comes to the family court system. I do think those can be implemented, at least in some material way.
Well, it's getting them to admit it too, that there is a problem.
Exactly.
I also, I have one thing on this, and that is that not all change is going to be legislative. There's a great deal of social change that needs to take place. And rather than using like criminal court as in my example, I'm going to go into divorce court, because that was my primary experience, set of experiences, I should say, that led me into the movement. And a great deal of the problem with divorce court is in the fact that when you break up a relationship, it is almost impossible to do so without animosity between the people breaking up. And so you have that issue of the child being used, you know, as a weapon against the other parent, the tug of war situation, and so on. And it does help. This also goes back into the women's voices thing as well. It does help for mothers to acknowledge that it is very important to keep the father in the child's life, and it's important for fathers to acknowledge that being important to the child's life doesn't mean that the mother's not important too. And when you're in a situation where there's a war basically between the parents and the court system favors one side, you end up with a social attitude where no matter what, the other parent is the enemy. And the discussions that take place around this movement, while we are, you know, we do have as a goal for the court system to take a more functional approach to custody, there is also that need to change social attitudes, and in particular change individual attitudes during divorce, so that the parents' focus becomes how do we maintain normalcy for the child, not how do I get what I want in spite of what he wants or in spite of what she wants. How do we work together needs to be the most important thing in order to sort of maintain the best situation for the children and a healthier situation for the parents as well. Because everybody talks about the damage that battle does to the kids. Most people don't think about the fact that you're pushing yourself closer to a stroke or a heart attack or some other early death due to stress every time you engage in a war with your ex-spouse over your child. And I watched, among my friends and family, people in my generation go through these battles and develop significant health problems that have occurred due to stress and due to life changes they've made due to that stress, that all stems from battling with the other parent over rights that they should be cooperating to achieve a balance in.
I wanted to add as well, because Hannah's right, legislative change is not enough. Just recently in Florida, I don't know if any of you know this, Governor Scott was yet again convinced to veto alimony and custody reform legislation that had 70+% public approval and had passed both houses with overwhelming bipartisan support. And the National Organization for Women and several other women's groups, feminist groups, lobbied hard for the week that he had in order to decide whether to sign or veto the bill. They managed to convince him yet again. They did this in 2013. They did this again just a month or two ago. That it would make women and children vulnerable to abusive fathers and ex-husbands and all of the same old rhetoric, demonization of men, blah, 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 blah. It would leave women in the street, women with their children in the street, because it would mean that lifetime alimony would no longer be a thing. There are men in Florida who cannot retire, who will never be able to retire because they are paying alimony for the rest of their lives over a marriage that only lasted 6-7 years. Sometimes didn't even have kids involved. Right? So this bill had overwhelming public support. It's very, very rare that you get a politician who has a public approval rating of over 40%. Right? This bill had over 70% public approval, and feminist groups convinced the governor to corrupt and subvert their democracy and veto it against the will of the people. Now, this is why social attitudes need to change, because a decision like that, the only reason Governor Scott can make a decision like that is because he knows that it will not mean political death for him, right? The public's attitudes, society's attitudes need to change so that when somebody pulls a bullshit move like that, right, they don't have a hope in hell of ever getting reelected. That is what needs to happen with society, with the culture, with the public. There needs to be an attitude that we're not going to tolerate this kind of thing anymore, right? So there you go.
I want to point out some things about that bill. It wasn't simply that they demonized fathers, they also mischaracterized the bill.
Yeah.
And this has been a repeated thing. This particular formula has been put forth repeatedly. And every time it's put forth, it is the same structure. The bill basically makes the default if there is no contest in the divorce. So nobody's saying, I want to do something else. And no situation in which the judge has said something else needs to happen, that it would be 50-50 custody. And feminists characterize it as an enforced 50-50 custody in all situations regardless, in order to torpedo it. So they basically have to flat out lie about what's under discussion in order to get their way. And they've done the same thing, when they do demonize fathers like that, they are basically generalizing what happens with some parents of both sexes onto all men and only men. There are abusive mothers. Statistics from the United States government actually show that the majority of parents who abuse are mothers. And that's been reducing over the last 12 years or so, but paternal custody has been increasing over the last 12 years or so, and child abuse has gone down. So this tells us that it is not strictly a male behavior. The fact that it is not all women tells us it's not strictly a female behavior. It's a dysfunctional behavior that happens in both sexes. So it's a lie to say that this is going to endanger children by placing them with abusive fathers, when the current dynamic is the mother is almost always favored in court, and the majority of abusers are mothers.
You mentioned divorce courts as your impetus for getting involved. Would you like to expand on, I think there was a specific case mentioned in your bio that really...
Yeah, the case that really got me the most involved, that was not my family situation, although I'm married to a divorced man, so I'm the second wife. So I've seen some of the issues with the child support system and the ability to really screw up a man's life, even if he doesn't quit his job, if he just gets fired. But what really made it hit home that something had to be done was a 7-year ordeal that a friend of mine went through, and I don't even know how many years it's been. Another friend of mine's still going through an ordeal of use of false accusations of domestic violence and intimate partner and sexual violence as a weapon in custody court. And this isn't a he said, she said situation where I'm just siding with the guy. I watched a court tolerate provable perjury in a woman. I watched a court not only tolerate provable perjury, but violent outbursts in the courtroom and complete refusal to follow a judge's orders because she had claimed domestic violence. This was a divorce in which the estranged couple was no longer living together, in which the accuser would claim that the man had done something on a certain time, on a certain day, at a certain location, and lo and behold, he would have physical evidence of his presence and activities in another location at that time. And never once was there any inkling of prosecuting this woman for perjury. Never once was she held accountable for filing false charges. Never once was she held accountable when she stalked him. She was actually stalking members of his family and assaulted a family pet. His sister and niece had to take out a restraining order against her. When she violated it, the local police refused to enforce the restraining order because it was a domestic case, and a local domestic violence victims advocacy group was backing her. So this situation was so convoluted and so strange. Like, I've described it as feeling like you fell down a rabbit hole and hit every bump on the way down. I watched him go through about 4 years of not being allowed to be alone. The only way that he could protect against being thrown in jail and falsely convicted was to document everything he did and have reliable witnesses. He had to have witnesses that when they came into court, the court wasn't going to look down their nose at him and say, well, we don't have to believe this person because this person is low class. We don't have to believe this person because this person has a conviction in their background. We don't have to believe this person because this person has, the other side is able to say, this person's had to go to rehab for alcoholism or drugs. You'd have people that their character would hold up in court because his character didn't matter, his history didn't matter, his lack of criminal conviction in any area didn't matter. The fact that he came from a good family didn't matter. The fact that you could prove she was lying didn't matter. All that mattered was that a woman was accusing a man of violent acts against her. And this has become a common thing. It's so common that his attorney actually wrote about it to the local newspaper, and his ex tried to use that in court and actually attempted to have her disbarred for violating attorney-client privilege, for talking about the problem without directly mentioning any of her clients. So that's kind of what got me started in this, was trying to spread awareness of that phenomenon, where the imbalance in today's domestic violence federal law in the United States has become a tool that can be exploited by unscrupulous women, by women who are not, their goal isn't necessarily to do the best thing for their children, they just want to beat their husband and their ex-husband, their soon-to-be ex-husband, in a case. You know, and this was, he got custody and she started making false accusations. There were no accusations before he got custody. And what's really caused this is a change that took place in the 90s. Prior to the 90s, there was a domestic violence law in the United States. Nobody really talks about it. It's not something that most people are aware of. And I'm not sure I can remember the exact, it was the Family Violence, there's like a set of initials, but it's basically the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, I believe, of 1984. Ronald Reagan signed it into law. And it provided for shelters. It provided for a police response. It provided for training to help law enforcement understand that just because violence is taking place within a family doesn't make it any less an assault, and it doesn't make their response any less important. But feminists came in throughout the 70s and 80s in the United States and pushed and pushed and pushed for domestic violence law to be gendered. And they won changes in the Violence Against Women Act that took protection away from men, that took protection away from boys over the age of 13 who were victims of domestic violence, that created training that was basically believe the woman no matter what, for police departments, for every level at the court, for the prosecuting attorneys, for the state attorney generals. They all go through training that is funded by this act. And then it also funds research done at shelters that now only accept women. So it's now a self-perpetuating cycle. Look, we see all of this only happening to women, so therefore it doesn't happen to men. Well, if you don't let men in and you don't look at what happens to men, of course you're not going to get any data on men's experiences. And that problem has created an environment in which women are actually facilitated in engaging in criminal acts. It's a criminal act to go into court and lie. It's a criminal act to file a false charge. It's a criminal act to abuse your child. And limiting your child to one parent when there are two loving, nurturing parents available is child abuse.
Yeah, there we go. I had a lump in my throat. Theron and Karen, what got you guys involved in the men's movement?
You go first. I didn't really have any personal thing at all, really. It wasn't anything that I witnessed going. I mean, like, I grew up in a family that was so normal that it's ridiculous. it would have made the most boring TV show ever. It might have been on TV in the 50s, I don't know. But, so I had this experience growing up, you know, with two parents who were always treating each other with respect as equal partners, collaborating on decisions that affect the whole family, backing each other up, never allowing us kids to play both ends against the middle, as many kids do, particularly after divorce. So I had this life growing up, and then alongside this life, sort of parallel to it, was this narrative about men and women, right? It was everywhere. And I was just looking at it and I was going, like, that's just complete bullshit. Like, how do people believe this stuff, right? Now, I didn't realize how damaging, how much that narrative had gotten its hooks, because I was born in the 70s, right, when this had only been really going on for about 10 years, and hadn't been, you know, hadn't gotten into the laws yet, really. I mean, there was all this informal bias. I mean, I'm sure men were being sentenced to 60% longer sentences than women back in the 50s, back in the 30s, right? But it wasn't sort of an openly talked about thing that men are awful, right? That men are horrible. Until about the time when I was born, that started to become more and more and more pervasive. And given the men I knew, and, you know, growing up with mostly guy friends, and I mean, sometimes they were jerks, but, you know, but not always, and they were generally decent. And I mean, it struck me as completely false. It was just this completely false story about what's going on out there. And after I split up with my ex, I stumbled across a men's issues website, and it was pretty hardcore. I mean, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Voice for Men, but I mean, this was a Voice for Men on crack, right? The guys there, they was sort of a little bit pickup artisty, a little bit traditionalisty. They did talk a lot about, you know, rights, right, and legislative equality and things like that, and raising awareness. But they didn't pull any punches. And I stumbled in there, ironically, with a group of feminists onto that blog. I was writing dirty books at the time, and I was a member of this writers forum that was like just infested with feminists. And one of them said, "Hey, look at these idiots over here, let's go make fun of them," and left the link. And so I went over, and it was a kind of a ridiculous complaining story, right? It was some guy was complaining that science fiction, you can't find hard science fiction anymore, you just can't. It's all been romanticized to appeal to women. It's just been feminized, blah, 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 right? So I'm reading through it, and I'm like, well, that's kind of a silly thing to complain about. And I'm reading through the comments, and one of the guys in the comments says, "Oh, well, the new Star Trek wasn't too bad. I totally ripped it off the internet and watched it 10 times, right?" And I'm sitting there looking at that, and then I was just like, I have to comment. I have to say something to this idiot. I was like, who would make a $320 million movie for an asshole like you who's just gonna steal it? At least your girlfriend will drag you to the theater, right? She'll buy you the Blu-ray, okay? So they all were like, she's right. And that was how I got started there. They just, I mean, I was really mean to this guy. I ripped a strip off of him, right? But the other guys there were like, you know what, she's right, that is kind of a dickbag move. And so essentially that's how, and then I got to talking to them, and they did not treat me nice because I was a girl. In fact, I had to prove that I wasn't going to expect special treatment before they started just relaxing. But talking with them, reading the articles on that website, reading about the Violence Against Women Act, reading about the Duluth model, reading about all of this stuff reading about men's experiences of domestic violence, their experiences of sexual violence, and their experiences with society or the police or the courts when they actually, you know, reach out for some sort of help or mitigation. That was what really got me interested, because that made me ask the question, why, if this is all going on, why is this other upper layer of everything, you know, this women are wonderful, men are jerks. How is, like, why do we believe that, right? And then allow this all to go on and not pay any attention to it. So that's what really got me interested. And I guess I was just good enough at, you know, sort of presenting that, that it just snowballed and I got more and more popular. And then I started getting emails from men who sort of said, you're the reason I didn't commit suicide. And so I kind of felt like I had to continue doing it. So, yeah.
Mine's not as interesting, and they're probably not warranted applause. I kind of got started, so I've always been interested in gender, or at least for a very long time. I always knew that there were men's issues. Like I was never so stupid to think that men are treated fairly all the time, throughout my whole life. But I started in university like 2 years ago. I started getting involved with campus activism, specifically like trans issues and whatnot. And then I realized what an absolute cesspool universities are. Because so here I was, and I was willing and ready to, for the first time in my life, really be an activist in terms of gender equality. And then I realized that my fellow activists, social justice activists, they weren't interested in their activism to include or consider the vulnerabilities of men, and really be about equality in that sense. And that didn't make sense to me. I didn't realize that was going to happen. I guess I was very naive at the time. But I didn't realize that they would not factor in men's issues when talking about trans issues, when talking about women's issues, when talking about gender equality and being on the forefront of gender activism. So I brought it up. Headphone. So I brought it up, and I was kind of being accused of being anti-feminist and misogynist.
They're synonymous, you know?
Oh, right, yeah, they are. And so I got disillusioned and pissed off. And then I actually started watching Karen's videos, and then I had ideas of my own, and I became kind of obsessed and monomaniacal, and my boyfriend at the time started hating me because I just couldn't stop talking about all of this stuff. And at the time he identified as a feminist, and I think he actually at one point was minoring in gender studies. Luckily I got him out of that, thank goodness. Yeah, so I was really, I'd had all these ideas, so I had to put it out, and so I started a YouTube channel, and I started talking about the issues, and people seemed to notice, and I'm still doing that, and yeah, so that's how it happened.
So you mentioned that you were accused of misogyny when you were part of the social justice circle jerk at SheForHe. So men's rights advocates are often accused of misogyny. So have you noticed any actual misogyny in the movement, and how does that compare to misandry or bigotry that you noticed when you were part of the aforementioned community?
Should I go first?
Yeah, it was a direct question to you.
Oh, to me, okay. Okay. Have I noticed? It's hard. I think there are misogynistic comments. But I always say, like, if it's some comment that just gets lost in the sea of comments and doesn't get a like or an affirmation, then it's just that idea doesn't get validation, which means, you know, the movement itself, or those also kind of in the movement, if they're not validating the idea, then I can't really say that men's movement is misogynistic, but obviously there are like sexist comments here and there. I just haven't seen that kind of affirmation. Even someone like Paul Elam, who is like hated for being like a misogynist and anti-feminist, I did an interview with him, and he's like the sweetest person on earth. He's such a sweet person, and like he's actually, we like communicate on by email now, and we actually have kind of a relationship going, and he's such a good, cool person. So yeah, is there like, of the sexism that I've seen, that I don't like these terms because they seem to have been co-opted a little bit. But for example, I have been in the movement. People have assumed to think they know what I mean based on the fact that I'm a woman. Oh, you're a woman, therefore I know what you're actually trying to say. Because women have these ways of doing things and blah, 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 blah. So kind of judging people based on such an arbitrary characteristic such as their gender, I mean, that is kind of sexist. So yeah, I've gotten that, and I've mostly gotten that from, you're gonna hate me, but like men going their own way. They've been the most. But having that said, I actually am a huge proponent of the MGTOW sect of the men's movement, and I've learned so much from them. But usually when people have that tone towards me, oh, yeah, you're a woman, so that's what you actually mean when you say that they are usually from that kind of part of the movement. So yeah, there are some biases, and I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like they're not there.
Okay, so we have a few questions from the live stream chat, and then after that we're gonna jump into audience Q&A, so if anyone has questions, you can start heading down. So we had a few questions about the wage gap, so I'll try and kind of compile them into one question. How do you feel about the push for the wage gap as a discrimination issue, and do you feel that this influences people's ideas about men's issues and men's rights?
I actually hate the push for the wage gap. I call it the wage gap myth, because it is. It's a myth. There is not a gap in wages. There's an earnings gap. And then there's a slight gap that can't be accounted for that feminists call a gotcha moment. But if you cannot prove it's discrimination, what right you have to assume it, when the vast majority of the rest of the so-called gap is provably not discrimination. And then even the federal government in the United States has its hands dirty in this. The government actually contracted research, and there was a report, the CONSAD report, that came out and demonstrated they could account for all but 7%. And this was a study of studies. There were like 50 different studies that they looked at. So there were 50 different sources of information, and they could not find evidence that there was this huge gap that was caused by discrimination. What they found was that men and women work differently, men and women live differently. Women are more likely to choose a work-life balance so that they can spend more time with their children. Women are less likely to take jobs that have hazard pay. Women are less likely to take night shifts. Women are less likely to get that shift differential because of that. Women are less likely to take dirty, stinky jobs that you can only get a man to do. And generally you can only get a man to do if you pay him a lot of money to do it, or if he can't get a better job. And so there are areas of employment in which women choose to lose out on higher pay for better living conditions related to their jobs. And that's not necessarily wrong. That's not saying a bad thing about women. It's not that it means that women are less capable, or women are lazy, or women are less valuable, or anything like that. But it does mean that it's not discrimination when they're not making as much money because they didn't make those choices. It doesn't mean that men don't deserve hazard pay when they climb a 1,000-foot pole, a 1,000-foot tower to change a light bulb. It doesn't mean that men don't deserve extra pay when they're going to be waist deep in raw sewage, or when they're working the night shift at a convenience store and taking a greater risk that somebody might come in with a gun and point it at them for whatever amount of money's in that cash register. And these are things that nobody likes to consider in the wage gap discussion. And it is really unfair to both sexes to not acknowledge the details. I think it's very manipulative of politicians and political groups to try to use this myth to pit people against each other and to get laws passed that are nothing but an effort to get more government control over the employer-employee relationship. And women really should think long and hard about pushing this, because if women get this pushed through, it's not going to mean that women are just going to get more money without changing the way women are expected to work. It's going to change the way women are expected to work, and it's going to remove choices that women have if they're in a good enough situation. And I'm aware of this because I wasn't always. Because of the child support system and the way it's run, and how imputed income can be used to essentially impoverish a man after a divorce, I was the breadwinner of my family for several years. And because my husband was trying to improve his income so that he could actually have the income that the court said he had, and be able to be a contributor to our household financially and still pay all of his child support, I also had to be the role that mothers usually are. So I had to take different jobs instead of trying to earn the way a man would earn. And it's a great deal harder to be the breadwinner of a family when you're trying to do so around a child's schedule and not just free to take that night job that doesn't end, that your shift doesn't end until after the kid's supposed to get on the school bus, when you have to be home during that time of day. And this is something that politicians and political groups do all the time. And it is a reason why when you hear about stuff like this, the buzzword wage gap is great as far as a propaganda tool. As soon as you say it, you've already said discrimination against women is happening and people buy it. You got to look past that. What are they really talking about? What's really going on? What are the dynamics? What needs to change? Does this need to be fixed? Is it really a broken thing? Do your research, because you cannot trust what either side of the discussion, is necessarily telling you without looking into it and making a decision for yourself.
I do want to say that the CONSAD report, the meta-analysis, one of the things that they noted, and this seems to be the case for every study that's done on the wage gap, is that there are some variables that we know are variables. And everybody here would agree that if you're willing to work overtime, if you're willing to stay on the weekend and finish that proposal, if you're willing to travel for work, right? That's going to affect your relative pay. You're going to get paid more. You're going to get your raises sooner, and you're also going to get promoted more often than somebody who just clocks out at 4:30 every single day and says, "Yeah, I'm done with all y'all." Okay, but that can't be quantified accurately enough to include in most of these studies what effect that has on pay. Another one is salary negotiations, right? That they can't quite figure out how. They know that men are much more likely to negotiate their starting pay than women are, but they can't quite figure out exactly how much of an effect that has on aggregate incomes. So those are two of the things that could actually account for that 4 to 7% that currently isn't accounted for. And there is some evidence, there is actually some evidence that in some fields, women are discriminated against, right? But there's also equal evidence, and possibly even better evidence, that in some fields, men are discriminated against. Try being a dental hygienist as a man, right? Or a massage therapist. Nobody wants a man in their personal space poking around at them, right? Both men and women would rather that person be a woman, right? And so maybe there's not a pay gap in those fields because the men just can't get the jobs to begin with, right? Primary school teaching, there's actually a pay gap in favor of men because men are made to feel so uncomfortable in the classrooms with small children that they end up actively seeking promotion into school administration, right? Or they specialize a little bit more and they go on to teach high school instead, right? This is what, or there's a pay gap among men in schools as well because men are more likely to teach summer school than women are. And they should be paid for that. So those are some of the things that I think there is discrimination that goes on in the workplace. There absolutely is. Most of it, I think, is soft discrimination, not hard pay discrimination. Most people are paid according to scale and pay grade. Most people are paid the exact same starting wage. There was no male waiter where I worked who was getting more than minimum wage. Actually, less than minimum wage because in Alberta, servers get less than minimum wage. So, but yeah, no, and none of us ever, we get a raise when minimum wage goes up, right? That's just how that works. So, yeah, there's in the areas where it really counts, right? Where you have people who are really struggling to get by. They don't have careers, they have jobs, right? And they are not the elites. And so much of these kinds of problems that feminism brings up are really problems that only affect maybe the top 30% of society. If you're making sandwiches and serving donuts at Tim Hortons, you're going to get paid the same whether you're a man or a woman. You just are. People with jobs, right, that aren't glamorous and that don't have any kind of, and they don't have letters after their names, they're not the ones that this is really going to be affecting, that any of this possible discrimination going on is going to be affecting. So
yeah, I'm kind of tired of talking about the wage gap because it's
stupid.
Yeah, but what I rarely see when the wage gap is discussed, I rarely see it being discussed from the other side. Maybe men work a little too hard. Maybe they don't have a balanced enough life and they don't have enough time to form a social network. Maybe this whole wage gap that indicates men earning more isn't necessarily a good thing for men, because I do see the men in my life not having really close friends like my father. He's such a hard-working man, but he doesn't have these he doesn't have this social network on which he can fall back. And I would speculate and go so far as to say that may be a factor in why men commit suicide, because they don't feel like they have anywhere to go. So yeah, I think we can talk about it from that angle as well. And just men generally taking care of themselves a little bit better. I have a family friend now who, also very hardworking doctor, never really, thought much of his own health, and now because they didn't catch it early enough, he has terminal cancer in the brain. And it's really sad because if they just got it a few months earlier, he could have still had a lot more years ahead of him. So yeah, these are like big things that I see when I look at the wage gap.
Do we have any questions from the audience? You can go to the mic.
Alison can see it.
So I recently discovered that the British Columbia Ministry of Public Safety has a document, policy document, regarding domestic violence that basically instructs police officers and other parties to view it as gendered crime where it's predominantly power-based crime that men inflict upon women, even though Statistics Canada shows that domestic violence is
It's patriarchy.
but equal. So in the document they justify it by saying that the majority of police-reported domestic violence is men attacking women. But of course that seems a little circular. If the police are going to treat it as men attacking women, then of course most reports are men are less likely to report. So my question is, since this is sort of an official government document, what can we do to get that changed? It seems like it's kind of like the Canadian equivalent of the Duluth model.
Actually, I was talking to Lauren Southern on her show on Rebel Media the other day about the Giongo-Meshi case, and one of the things that really struck me about that case is that what looked to be incompetence on the part of police investigators and the Crown in being able to essentially know what the case was about before presenting it in court and getting egg all over their faces. And just actually allowing their complainants to lie on the stand over and over and over about material things. That's not incompetence, that's policy, okay? That's policy now. And the problem with policy is it does not have to be debated in a parliament or a legislature. It does not have to go to the sober second thought of the Senate. It does not have to be voted on, right? Policy is chosen usually by a committee of hand-picked individuals, an action committee, right? Of hand-picked individuals who were not elected, but they're considered experts by some people, and they write a policy document that kind of, it's sort of like, in that movie, The Thing, when it puts out its sort of tentacles and digs them into people, right? That's what it does with the system, right? It's super easy to get it entrenched in the way the system works. It's super difficult to get rid of it, right? Because it's not legislation. You can't just say, okay, we're going to strike this law down, right? It has to be addressed through extremely difficult court challenges based on its constitutionality underneath the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? Which in and of itself allows for exactly this type of discrimination. It says you cannot discriminate based on sex, and then in the very next line it says, well, except for because women used to be oppressed, so you can, right? That's essentially what that document says. Right, is that, oh, you can't discriminate against women, but you can discriminate in favor of them. It's totally legal. It's totally it's written into our Constitution, right? So, yeah, there's no getting rid of it. There's really no, the only way you can get rid of it is if you amass so much public support that there's just no way that they can continue to do it, right? Either that or you do it incrementally over the next 150 years, right? But that's about it. I don't know if we're going to be able to get rid of it.
That's actually how it got in there. That's actually how it got in there in the first place. And I'm speaking from a perspective, again, United States law, and looking at the Violence Against Women Act. And the way that was brought about was a continued slow boil, continued chipping away a little bit at a time. And to be honest, and I'll probably get a lot of flack for saying this, but do you know how feminists became known as experts in the field of domestic violence? They told everybody they were experts, and that was it. I mean, that's basically the whole of how they got there. They decided to have involvement, and they told everybody it was a certain way, and they completely ran over the best expert that they could have brought forth instead.
Marie Strauss?
Actually, Erin Pizzey.
Oh,
was the person
yeah.
I was thinking of. She started the first in Chiswick, England.
In London.
In the UK, and she started the first shelter, and she learned things at that shelter. And one of the best ways to learn about people is to work with people. She learned things at that shelter that have been ignored by the entire domestic violence victims advocacy community for decades.
Erin Pitsey.
Erin
She
Pitsey.
opened the world's first domestic violence shelter in 1971 in Chiswick, London.
Look for a book. She's written numerous books, but probably the one that first comes to my mind is "Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear."
And prone to violence.
Yeah, prone to violence. That's a good
What's her
one.
website?
D-I-Z-Z.
Domestic violence.
Yes, Pizzey.
I think she runs whiteribbon.org now.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the idiots at the White Ribbon campaign, which is like totally Duluth model based, they bought all of the domains except for .org, and so Paul noticed that, Paul Elam, and he was like, woohoo, I'm buying this. He bought it, and then he gave it to Erin.
Yeah.
So.
But what Karen was saying about raising awareness of this is vital because people have no idea. If you start talking about, oh, the Violence Against Women Act is bad, the first response you get is, oh, MRAs want to legalize beating women. That's not what we said. We talk about it being a gendered approach. One of the things that is completely ignored is two-way violence. And more than half of domestic violence relationships are two-way. And feminists will characterize female violence as self-defense even when it's the initiating violence in the situation. And a lot of times they'll characterize it as not violent for women to do things that are characterized as violent when a man does it. If a man stands up in your personal space and yells at you at the top of his lungs, everybody knows that's violent. Everybody's, oh, he's being aggressive. If a woman does it, you must have done something wrong. It's your fault, it's not her fault. Nobody would say that about a woman being yelled at by a man, but almost everybody says it about a man being yelled at by a woman. And if you push somebody and push somebody and push somebody and they push you back to get you out of their space, if a woman does that, it's considered self-defense against somebody who's being aggressive. But if it's the woman doing the pushing over and over again, putting her hands on your shoulders or your chest or your face and pushing, and you strike back and you're a man, even if all you do is put your hands on her wrists to stop her from hitting you, or put your hands on her shoulder to move her away from you, that's considered a violent act. So where did we get here? If you look back in, well, actually, I think I got this in an article. There's a link to a report from testimony in front of the United States Congress in 1976 or 78, in which a bunch of feminists, well-known feminists, spoke to Congress and told them that domestic violence was something that men do to women, that there was no data on female violence, there was no indication that men were suffering this problem, and this was how it needed to be approached. And then there's like, it's a 700-page document that it's linked to in the article. And the article is abused men and boys feminism's acceptable losses, I believe. And what I learned when I was researching to see what needed to be changed in order to solve this problem was that there has been a concerted effort for all that time. And in order to solve the problem and get us back to a situation where laws regarding domestic violence approach the situation as something that both sexes do and both sexes need protected from, and both sexes need that commit it are equally in need of and entitled to therapy to improve their behavior, rather than an approach as evil people who just hate the opposite sex and want to control them. In order to get to that point, we first have to get people to understand that when a woman does something violent, it's still violent, even if she's a woman. Even if we have more sympathy for her than we have for a man, it's still violent. And that in order to reduce that violence, we need to approach both sexes' violent behavior as a dysfunctional behavior. Even if we don't demonize it, even if we don't say women are terrible people for hitting men, the way that we do say men who hit women are terrible people, a man who hits a woman isn't a real man. We don't have to do that to men. We don't have to do it to women. But we do have to approach the behavior as something that needs to be changed on a societal level. And if we can do that, if we can get society to that point, we can get society to a point of talking about changing law and policy without getting all up in arms and saying, because you want to change an act that's called the Violence Against Women Act, you're for beating women.
They say we live in a binary and a zero-sum game and just want to pit the genders against each other. Yeah, that's what we're all about.
You're not gonna answer it? Okay. Sorry, I typed it out earlier. Sorry, it's more for Karen. You said earlier, I don't think we can ever achieve true equality across the board. So I was curious if you're rather cynically suggesting that there will never be a time where groups like SFU and AMB aren't needed.
I don't know. I don't know about that. I think that we can maybe get to a place where everybody can just live with things. I mean, I don't think life is ever going to be perfect for anybody. There are some things that I don't think can be removed from sort of the human way of thinking. Like men's and women's brains are different. That affects men's ability to, like I said earlier, sort of come together collectively with each other. I think it impedes that a little bit, particularly when the idea is, when it's so easy to construe it as pitting men against women. So I think that we're not going to be able to ever get through it, but I think maybe we can get to a place where things are livable, and I'm perfectly fine with having, you know, no advocacy groups, you know, unless you actually need them, right? I mean, like, look at where feminism's at right now. They're bitching and moaning about how sexist air conditioning is, right? Okay, and they're bitching about it in an environment where women are allowed, right? They don't have to, but they're allowed to go to work with bare shoulders, bare arms, and bare legs, okay? And the men in that environment, for whom the air conditioning is set for their comfort level, are wearing long trousers, long sleeve shirts, buttoned all the way up to the top, a tie, and a blazer. That's what they get to wear every single day in that same office. And these women are saying, turn the heat up, it's freezing in here. No, put on some clothes, right? I mean, like, if you look at the level of complaint and the level of entitlement, the room should be geared towards me and my greater freedom to wear whatever the hell I want to work, right? And these guys can just sweat it out in a suit. Like, I'm sorry, if this is all they can find to complain about now, they need to go away, right? And eventually, it's my hope that we get to the point where people are going, if that's all they can, and really saying it and meaning it and it being true, if this is all they have to complain about, then they need to go away. I would love that. I think most men are going to be happy long before we hit that point. Most men are going to be okay with the situation. They're going to be content enough, right? Long before we hit that point. Right, that point where we're unnecessary, that point where we're just a bunch of ridiculous douchebags complaining about nothing, right? Or complaining about things that are actually unfair in our favor, right? I think that this movement is going to disintegrate long before it becomes completely unnecessary. So I don't think it's a danger that we're going to be around longer than we're useful.
I have something to say. I know you didn't ask me a question, but I'm going to say something anyway. I'm kind of from the Thomas Sowell kind of school of there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And I think myself and like Karen, like it's about finding the best trade-off, but we'll never find like, I think that's the problem with feminism today as well, is that they don't want the best trade-off, they want everything, because that's what a utopia is, it's everything is good. And that's pretty dangerous. So yeah, I also don't think along utopian lines.
Hello. So just got a quick question. I know you guys hate talking about the pay gap, but I gotta get this out of the way. But you were guys talking about it. It just came to my head when you guys were just talking about it. I've noticed like recently on the Democratic side from the U.S. campaigns and all such, where Sanders and Clinton are talking about the pay gap, and I just kind of realized, thinking to myself, with having this false information and not actually looking into the details of this pay gap, I feel that our future generations will be persuading these lies and not realizing that it's kind of manipulative to the point where it kind of creates an out of balance towards, women getting where they were. So do you feel like this kind of pay gap will be kind of exploited in the near future?
It will. It'll be exploited as much as the general public allows it to be exploited. One of the things that I was just talking about this earlier today, we can never sit back and trust our media. We can never sit back and trust our politicians. It's their job isn't necessarily to tell us the truth. And in fact, telling us the truth with politicians can be detrimental to their job, because their job is to maintain their status as elected officials. And in the media, their job is to get a readership. And so it's our job to force them to maintain credibility. It's our job to hold them accountable for what they say. It's our job to call them liars when they lie, and to tell them they can't have their jobs and continue to lie to us. Whether it's not voting for politicians who lie all the time, or demanding in writing, by writing to them and writing to the media that they stop lying. Whether it's abandoning media that we know we can't trust for media that's newer, and when we fact check it, we find that they are not lying to us. Whether it's when you see an article in a publication that you like to read, and somebody has reported something that is factually incorrect, call them out on it in the comment section underneath. Write to the editor, why are you allowing this lie to be told in your publication? I thought journalism was about sharing information, not spreading lies. That's what we have to do. And until we do that en masse, that stuff's going to be exploited. The ability to lie to the public with impunity will always be exploited by people in power and people who can profit from it, as long as they're able to maintain that power and maintain that profit by doing so.
I did want to also mention, because you said, you think the pay gap, the wage gap is going to be exploited. Well, I would say Obama's done nothing but beat this drum, okay? And one of the funniest things I think I have ever seen was his press secretary defending the White House's own wage gap to a reporter from the Washington Post. Okay, because in the White House, on the president's, the entire staff, right, women earn 88% of what men earn. And he was called on the carpet, and what did he say? He said, we pay men and women equally for equal work. But there are some mitigating factors, such as the number of hours worked and the years of experience and what kind of education they bring to the table and all of this other. Oh my goodness! And then, the next week, Obama's like, women only earn 78 cents to a man's dollar. It's a travesty. Women deserve equal pay for equal work. Like, liars, 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 liars. Absolutely ridiculous.
Even Hillary Clinton pays women on her staff less than she pays the men.
Oh, she pays them even more less than Obama does.
Yeah, she's been busted for that, and she's made excuses for it too. So this is like all across the board. Probably one of the angriest moments I had, though, in watching the election process and the campaign process take place, was one of the Republican debates where they just had this big free-for-all, and I think there were like 12 people up on the stage.
Oh yeah.
And they brought up the wage gap, and they brought up women's issues, and all of them just right down the line went through and started talking about what they were going to do for women.
Oh yeah.
When have you ever heard politicians bend over backwards and fall all over themselves to talk about what they were going to do for men? They don't even do that for the most part with children.
Well, they do when they want to send them off to die in war.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
But if you come back alive, you get a government, you get the GI loan.
No, you get ignored by the speed corner.
You get ignored by the. You don't get medical care. You get ignored by the VA.
I lost 2 good cousins to the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and it's hilarious too, because they just these are the evil, misogynistic, woman-hating Republicans who are waging a war on women, and they're just pandering. Like, I'm not even going to say it. I'm not going to say it.
But this is why in the movement a lot of us will say this is not a left-right issue. It's not. Both sides engage in this type of behavior, this women first and only women and so on.
At least they can agree on something.
Yeah.
It's a start.
We have an update. Allison's arrival time should be about 5. So when she gets here, we're going to take about a 10-minute break and then start her presentation at about 5:10, 5:15. So.
Excellent.
Hi there. I just want to frame this as saying that I'm trying to get at this from a social politics level, not like a who are you voting for kind of level. But I probably mentioned this before. My sort of journey with this started a year or 2 ago with watching Karen's videos, which I was linked to very helpfully from a Vice article talking about the honey badgers and how they think that victims deserved it or something like that. So I went there and I was like, oh, this really sound like terrible people. I'm gonna watch the video. And then of course I ended up watching Karen's videos because I was like, what is this guy talking about? And I'm not really into Vice magazine anymore. But so I considered myself like a very almost progressive, not really knowing what that meant, and still consider myself like a classical liberal-minded person. But with going through this, it started with watching your videos and then watching a few of the other things, talking to John the Other and a lot of those people within the manosphere. But then through, I think maybe it was one of your videos, I linked Gad Sad, and then I started watching Rick Rubin and all of his people and all of those guys and Sam Harris, and getting just like, whoa, okay. So then you start realizing, if you branch out, that a lot of this has to do not just singularly with women's and men's issues, but also with this sort of like social justice mentality, and then the progressivist, Marxist, leftist sort of part of the liberal movement that Rick Rubin always talks about is dividing the left, so to speak.
Dave Rubin.
Did I say Rick? Yeah, sorry. Dave Rubin. Totally different ballgame. So, understanding that you're talking about this because this is what you talk about, and not expecting you to constantly branch out into the wider sphere. How inseparable do you think those issues are? Talking about feminism and men's issues, and then talking about the regressive left, as Mashid Nawaz calls it.
You made a good video on this actually just a while back, didn't you? About how liberal principles really isn't that right. It's about who doesn't have the dominant voice.
Well, okay, yeah, there is that. I mean, sort of the whole idea of regressive values in terms of suppressing speech, suppressing ideas, limiting what people are allowed to say and hear, and all of this. These are not specifically leftist behaviors. What's a fatwa, right? It's trying to control what people say and what people are able to hear, and I would not consider a fundamentalist Islamist to be a progressive liberal or a progressive leftist. So it really is about power trying to preserve itself, right? Now, the regressive left is interesting because it harnesses the power of victimhood in a very specific way. And we could see this also, the power of victimhood in terms of there's always a stinky bilge of that at the base of every genocide, right? At the very underbelly of it there was a reporter who covered all of the Bosnian genocides and he talked to all 3 sides, and they all believed completely that they were the victims of the others, right? That the others had victimized them. And so it's a very, very dangerous narrative. It really, really is. In Rwanda, the Hutus felt that they were the victims of the minority Tutsis. And look what happened. And then, of course, the Tutsis, having been brutally victimized by the Hutus, then went and did their own atrocities after they regained control. So being victimized gives you it's a really, really big incentive to not care about other people, to not respect them as human beings, to, just considering yourself a victim of, I'm a victim of this large black man in the second row, and therefore I don't have to consider him to be a full human being and deserving of rights. And so there's that. What the progressive left does that other ideologies don't is that they seem to want to divide the classes of victims into ever smaller and smaller, and it's like they're sorting like Smarties on a table, and it's the green ones in this pile and the pink ones in this pile, and I mean that seems to be what they're, and I don't know why. I don't know whether this is just a psychological phenomenon, because they are so dependent on this idea of the sort of Marxist oppressor conflict, that they have this unbelievable urge to pit everybody in society against each other. But one thing that I do find really, really interesting is the majority of the people who are actually engaged in this are wealthy, white. They're wealthy and they're white, right? They are academics, right? They are privileged people. They're highly educated, right? These are the people who are constructing all of these narratives and teaching them to young, impressionable, dumbass university students, right? Who then go out and, just the dumbass ones, they're not all dumb. But, they just, so it's really interesting to actually see this sort of, there's these elites, they're wealthy, they're respected, they have positions of high status, right? They're not worried about money, for sure, right? And they are telling all of these young people who really have more important things to worry about than microaggressions. I mean, they need to worry about what's going to happen when they want to retire, because Social Security is going bankrupt, right? In the US and in Canada. They're going to have to worry about the fact that the population pyramid has been tipped on its head, and they are going to be, there are a smaller and smaller number of them, and they are going to have to carry larger and larger numbers of elderly people who have higher and higher expenses and expectations because of advances in medical science. I mean, healthcare was easy for the government to pay for when all you had was plaster casts, penicillin, and Band-Aids. That was pretty much it, right? But now it's a lot more expensive, and it's my kids that are going to pay for all this, right? Microaggressions, who the fuck cares, right? But they're being taught. It's almost like they're being given this long con to distract them against all the really important things that they should be thinking about, and just ripping each other to shreds while they're doing it. Right? It's I don't know if that answered anything.
I have a little bit to add, because I think most of the nature of the question was regard to how politics affects this and how it affects the approach. You kind of have to understand the difference between left and right, and how they approach law and policy, what they're trying to control. Because you're dealing with the same mass of people when it comes to politicians and policymakers. It's just that their excuses for the things they do are slightly different. So collectivists are more interested in controlling your property and how you use it, your money, your items that you use, the fruits of your labor, and even your labor itself. And traditionalists, particularly the conservative end of traditionalists, are more interested in controlling your family structure and maintaining a particular type of family structure. Now, it's neither one of them is necessarily evil for feeling entitled, or not entitled, but feeling like they are the best people for that job. Where it becomes evil is when they start doing it to the detriment of the public. And what we want to look at as a movement is, in order to communicate with these groups and affect change with these two groups, when you have to approach politics, you look at what they're trying to control and what things they need to, that they won't understand about our goals or the issue at hand, that if understanding those things, if we can allow them to understand those things or help them to understand those things, it would change their approach. So when you're approaching a Republican politician, for instance, in the United States, or a right-wing politician that is a more family-oriented politician, you're not necessarily facing the same misconceptions about family structures and family law that you would be facing where you're looking at a collectivist, and particularly somebody in the identity politics area. But at the same time, when you look at issues like the wage gap, or myth, or domestic violence, or any more social issue that has been really hammered at by collectivists or by identity politics ideologues, they're not going to, you're not going to be holding the same misconceptions there as you would see with traditionalists. And you kind of have to look at what lessons you need to bring forward and what information you need to get across. And it's not a matter of withholding information, it's a matter of making sure you're targeting the areas where they don't know things and understanding that they haven't developed. That it's just as wrong to discriminate against a man in a particular area as it is to discriminate against a woman, and what that damage is, that they would understand, hey, this actually is an issue that I can identify with. And a really good example of that is in the area of sexual violence. I've noticed this in conversations on Twitter. I get a lot of pushback from feminists because I'm very critical of feminism's approach to this. And I got really good reason for that. If you look back in America's history, almost all of our research that comes out of my country, and it's actually affected world government, has affected research on this throughout the world, is based on a type of survey method that was created by Mary Koss back in the 80s, that was designed to define people's experiences for them, instead of asking people what happened to them and basing her understanding of prevalence on that. One of the things Koss did that was really reprehensible was define rape to exclude people who had been forced to penetrate their perpetrator. And what that does is it excludes female perpetrators who victimize males.
Well, it also excludes a Catholic priest who performs fellatio on a 3-year-old boy.
Well, it
right?
actually doesn't. Well, yeah,
no,
it does. But so what we end up with then is an entire body of evidence that rape is perpetrated by men against women, not the reverse, when it's not true. They designed the research to not see it. And so you approach the situation this way. Is it wrong to tell somebody that has been raped that they haven't been raped because of their gender? This is a very fundamental question. And does it become not wrong because the gender isn't the gender that we sympathize with? This is something that social justice, whether you agree with identity politics, whether you agree with dividing everything into this person is more victimized because this person is a minority, or this person is female, or this person grew up poor as opposed to wealthy, the right to bodily autonomy is something that we can all agree on. And the fact that it would be wrong to define a violation of that to exclude a group of people based on who did it to them or based on what sex they are, that's something that we can connect on regardless. And there's a petition now because of conversations that were opened that way rather than approaching it as all of the feminist activism on this is bad, but actually going through and saying, well, hey, this is a problem and we need to do something about this situation. There have been feminists in the UK that have started a petition in response to men's rights agitation on this topic to include male victims and female perpetrators in the UK's rape law. And that's how you end up, that's how that affects it. That's how politics affects this, is how you know how to approach the people that you need to talk to get things changed. And what you need to know about them, what they need to know about you.
I do want to say, if you actually want a really, really, really cool lecture on sort of the difference between how the left and the right, or liberals and conservatives, I guess he calls them, approach things, and the different ways that they view just what is good. Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-G-H-T, his Boyarsky lecture from, I think it was 2009 at Duke University. It's available on YouTube. Watch it. Everybody should watch it because it's a very good lecture.
We have about 10 minutes left, so maybe time for one more question or two if they're quick.
Okay,
Well, the questions are always quick. It's the answers.
yeah.
Good point.
For the past 5 years or so, we've seen an explosion of discussion over men's rights, especially over social media utilizing tools like YouTube and Twitter, and to a lesser degree Facebook, although they're like blocking everything now. But how important do you think that role plays in hopefully progressing more lobbyist groups like Cafe and things like that?
Well, I don't think that a group like Cafe could have existed the way it does until after there had been some headway being made online. National Coalition for Men down in the States has been around for a long time, right? And they have some very, very good sort of, they get private funding from private donors. They've always had a cash flow. They've always had an actual office. But they tend to do, they tend to write a lot of letters in exquisitely threatening legalese to, say, airlines who make male passengers move when they find out they've been seated next to an unaccompanied child because, oh, pedosteria, right? So they do that kind of stuff. They don't end up in the news very much, unless there's a movie like Divorce Court or something like that, where you would want to reach out. You'd be looking for. Cafe has put on a lot of events. They've gotten a lot of publicity and a lot of attention, and I don't think that they would have really been able to do that if it hadn't been for the sort of swelling of discussion online and on social media about men's issues over the last 5-6 years. So yeah.
I got one thing to add to that. Part of the importance of this is you got one person that writes to their legislator and says, hey, this problem exists and I would like to see something done about it. And that nobody else is writing to the legislator. And there's an opposing viewpoint that the legislator already has or that's already expressed. They won't do anything. They'll give you lip service and that's it. If you have 50 people a day writing to them and they become either the loudest voice or they become a loud enough voice to compete in the arena of discussion on it, then the legislator has to pay attention. And that's one of the big differences.
Okay, do we have time for one more?
Yep, time for one more.
All right, I want to have a smoke scene.
Awesome. So, in conversation with people on men's rights and just issues of equality, I've had it happen many times where you can present blatant, like very clear empirical information to show that the side that they're stating is incorrect or insubstantial. And one of several things, well, more than that, but two things generally happens. There is a resistance to acknowledge it in the first place, and even if you get past that point, there is either a shutdown that they don't want to talk about it anymore, or they don't care. So my question is, and this is to anyone who has an opinion, how would you recommend, if you think it's possible, to get past any of those hurdles?
A lot of times when I'm in a situation, I'll gauge whether or not I think it's possible to get past those hurdles with that person. And if I think it is, I switch from making definitive statements to asking them questions. Because a lot of times people are more able to get a grasp on information if you help them look at things from their own side of it and reach that conclusion themselves. Instead of saying, current rape law is bad, then you start asking the questions like I was describing earlier. Is it wrong to tell somebody who was raped that it wasn't rape because of their gender? And when they start thinking about it for themselves, when they're not being confronted with something that confronts their narrative, it makes it a lot easier for them to open up and actually think about it.
I would say too that sometimes you have to look at it like, and this is why all of these discussions really should not be happening in private email conversations or personal messages with or one-on-one, because sometimes, particularly when you have somebody who is like that, who's just like refusing to they're resisting accepting the evidence, they're claiming that it's false or it's propaganda that's been invented, or they somehow it's just different, and they don't want to talk about it. You're not discussing with them to convince them. You're discussing with them to convince everybody else who's watching, right? And so if they're completely intractable, there are some people, like Hannah said, that you can reach with just changing your approach, asking questions, being reasonable, being kind, right? But if you got somebody that, like, there are some of these women who stalk my channel, and they really need to be on medication. No, if you read their comments, there are 3 of them, and their comments are a lot like Vincent van Gogh's paintings. They're sort of beautiful in their scariness, but and their chaos, right? So yeah, but those kinds of women, one of the best things you can do, or those kinds of people, one of the best things that you can do is just poke them, just keep poking them, and just allow them to escalate out there in public, where everybody can see they're representing the opposition to my position, right? Or people who are just extremely hostile, right? And you know that they're never, just go ahead and keep escalating. Make sure it's public, make sure it's in a public comment section, make sure it's somewhere where people are going to be able to see it, right? Because if all they've got is you're wrong and an asshole, like people are going to notice. They're going to notice, and they're going to go, well, maybe I need to rethink this, because, first I was on her side, but, or that male feminist side, but, you're presenting it, she's not presenting a case, right? So I think some people you just have to just kind of give up. It's hard when it's somebody that you know and care about.
Okay, so we've run out of time for questions. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion part of the panel. We will be giving a short 10-minute break so Karen can have a cigarette. Out in front we have our table. It's nice and purple. It has some promotional materials on it and our precious collection jar. So yeah, see you guys at about 5:15.
Smash that motherfucking microphone.
And, oh, thank you. No, I look at the fact that
They're gonna hear
real hardship.
Oh, whatever.
And I'm just grew up in foster care. I'm going to use this as the only person at the university who did not have parents or family to go to at Christmas. So, right. So my experience was very different, and I sort of went through this victim phase where I was like, your experience matters less. I'm more disadvantaged than you, so fuck you and your privilege. But at the same time, that makes you really shitty. That's a really shitty personality characteristic to develop personally, because it cuts off attitudes of other people, and you can experience are so subjective, and yeah, you may have grown up as a man, shouldn't be like being a Prince of Wales, but who's to say your experience? Like, I cannot quantify your experiences and how it affected you.
I think it's connected to the webcam. I'm back.
There are, and what I find is that the clothing it tends to create many variables, like you need to have someone who's indigenous, and just because, you know, it's just like we're getting fetishization of the other. Like, I did support a Green candidate the last federal election. Just however, I remember the volunteers would be dragging my hair out and scrambling for a bucket of rubber to make being considered to be another candidate, and yet they all kept on it and the rubber come up. Bang this damn 30 minutes because not because volunteers.
Were you at the meeting yesterday?
Yeah, I was. You were there yesterday.
I wasn't there.
Yeah, the school teacher. But no, we actually animated. First, just before 7 o'clock, there was about like a little bit under 20, and then afterwards, about 40, 50 people at once. So yeah, most people. There's like most people had to leave before Karen showed up, and then by the time what's her name? Karen? Yeah. When she showed up, we were like 5 people. So, yeah. But yeah, it went pretty good. But it was really loud, actually. That was, they had a live band.
So we have Mike, and then Amy.
Oh, Antonio, I have my lab mic too. Do you want me to put it on this one?
I'm just doing B-roll since there's already somebody covering it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just because there's no way. We got here and like they started, so there's no way I was gonna get set up.
Okay. So I can at least. Oh, they're recording the whole thing?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
We have the live stream going, and we're recording it.
Oh, it's live stream, huh?
Yeah.
To which channel?
SQA.
Okay.
Is it cafe? Okay, it's cafe.
Okay. All right.
Between 50 here and 50 online, we're watching the panel.
Cool. You should have done a bit more promotion. We'll do that next time.
I'm just trying to figure out how my
I'm actually just setting up the slides.
Okay, I want to just leave it up and copy.
Yeah. So it's not very fun. It's just technical issues. And setting up my notes, as it were.
This is the predicament. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, what's that? What else? So you don't need to have your recorder.
Yeah.
I mean, you could always just have your recorder while it's sitting there. And you'll be right. I don't know.
You know if the audio jack is you have any sound? Or it's like this. Okay.
My
What's the
yeah, it's a metal ring.
Okay,
so it's like the last straight thing.
Okay, so we're calling it 30. We should probably have time.
Yeah, no, it is. What should I do guys do? Yeah, no, I'll write that down. No, I don't think we're
Alright.
Garrett, how's it going?
It's going good. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
I drove in yesterday.
Yeah, it should be functional.
Massive South America. I was driving 7 years in a 120 zone.
Yeah, because I'm not like, I mean, west side, so.
And everybody's highway and lightning, torrential rain.
You're gonna come in here, public has one of you.
And then hail. And this guy was
How do you make that work? Yeah. Do we need to turn the lights down?
Hi, Antonia. How are you doing? You're the one who booked with me?
Oh,
How do you like how everything's going so far?
Good. I was stressed for obvious reasons, but
Yeah,
there we go. It's a nightmare.
oh, let's see.
No, it's just
Drag it back. That way it's not like we're in the middle of the.
okay, so do I need to stick right here to just stand on
I'm just gonna see if
do I have to stand right here for the microphone?
I guess we could drag one. You can put one in there.
yeah, because it's the overwhelming.
Let me make sure that I can be.
Yeah, that's like a government. Yeah, it's a policy document. And it's.
Oh, that gives me a bit more room. Hello. Oh, this will work. A little bit difficult to juggle.
TJ? Is that what? What?
Yeah, I think there's like a skirt.
Oh, okay. You wanted me to tilt it up?
Yeah, tilt it up.
More up?
Oh my goodness.
Oh my god, Phil.
Yeah, I have lost. Oh, it's right there. I don't know where my husband is actually. Oh, I wonder, can I use my lav mic over there, or will that blow everything up?
Sorry,
Can I use my lav mic? Or will that blow everything up?
I believe you could have your mic on.
What?
We're gonna see where it's at.
All the way back?
What
do you want from me?
I have questions. How do we get rid of against women's
Just put one at her and one at the presentation.
Yes, it is.
How much?
As ready as ever.
Alright, because I get a show on camera.
I'm going to try not to destroy this expensive equipment.
The two webcams?
You can always go out the back.
Are they?
Well, but that's closer to the bathroom.
So, hopefully you all had a nice 15-minute break. Alison's going to be starting her presentation now. So, without further ado, let's get to that.
All right, well, let's just get stuck right in then. That's what I usually say on the radio show. If I can get this working right.
Oh, the airline's going to stop you forever.
During the presidential elections in 2014, Professor Drew Weston placed committed Republicans and Democrats in fMRI scans, you know, those awful coffin things. And he recorded their brain states as they were presented with a series of 7 slides. The statements in each set of slides were attributed to either George Bush or John Kerry. The first slide presented an initial statement, and the second slide presented a contradictory statement. The remaining slides determined how much each of the participants felt that the two statements were in contradiction. And the 5th slide included a slide that sort of gave an excuse for the contradiction. The subjects' responses depended entirely upon which person was part of their party. So if they were Republican, the responses would be different for John Kerry versus George Bush, and the same for a Democrat. When the candidate was not a candidate from their party, their responses were indicated entirely reasonably. They were judging this in an entirely logical way. All of the cold areas of their brains lit up. And they correctly identified the fact that these statements were contradictory. But when the statements were made by someone from their own party, from their own established party, their brain immediately lit up with distress. But almost as quickly, their brain started to clamp down on that distress by using what they call motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning rifles through the stores of your brains and finds whatever information it can to confirm your already existing belief system. And what it does is it's solely for tamping down on that distress whenever you get any kind of information contrary to your most cherished held beliefs. In this case, if you're a Republican, that George Bush had said anything contradictory, or if you're a Democrat, that John Kerry had said anything contradictory. But what was really interesting was that after they had finished this motivated reasoning and justified the contradiction to themselves, even though the contradiction was plain, it's black and white, the facts were there. They just completely rewrote the facts to justify the contradiction. What Dr. Weston found, or what Professor Weston found, was that their reward circuits lit up like a Christmas tree. So they were shot full of dopamine. So in other words, we have a system in our brain that incentivizes cognitive dissonance and ignoring facts that are completely in opposition to our own perceived identities. The further researchers into this area also found that when you're presented with facts that are inconsistent with your perceived identity, there's a backfire effect that causes you, probably through the aforementioned reward system, to believe even more firmly. Even when you're presented with facts against your belief, you start to believe even more firmly in what you already believe. And why am I talking about all this in a speech regarding men's issues? Because setting a bunch of facts before you is only going to convince you if you're already convinced. If there's anyone in this crowd, I'm sure you look like a very friendly crowd, so I'm sure you're not here to throw tomatoes or whatever, but if there was anyone in this crowd who wasn't already convinced by these facts, they would only be hardened in their position by putting facts in front of them. It's quite a conundrum, isn't it? And one of the things that we're dealing with with men's rights issues is that our beliefs about gender are so much more fundamental to our sense of identity than politics. Like way more fundamental than being a Democrat or a Republican. So we're dealing with a situation where these are ingrained beliefs, and we are fighting not just against those ingrained beliefs, but also against that reward system, that anytime someone hears something outside of where they're comfortable, where their identity lies, they have an immediate reward system that will make them rearrange the truth to be something else. That's you know, when I read this kind of stuff, it's like, what is the point? I might as well leave. You know, whatever. What am I doing here? Let's go home. It's over. Everybody who's convinced will be convinced, right? What's the point? But I have spent now 2 days, literally 2 days, traveling to get here. And some of you, okay, some of you may have. I apologize. Some of you may be somewhat aware that we attempted to get on our plane 3 times before we finally got on the plane, 12:30 this morning. And as I was in the airport, I learned that this was starting at 3, so I knew that I would miss a good half of it before I could go. But whatever, I still believe that there is a way to actually get to people. And I'm going to lay out my ideas right here, right now. First of all, we need to start with where we connect, where we have a connection with people who are motivated to look at the world in terms of women's issues. And that's where I'm going to start. And I apologize, it's going to maybe a little bit of stop and start. And I think that actually this is something that even everybody in this room can agree on. We don't want to lose sight of women's issues when we look at men's issues. We want to make sure that women are still in the equation. We're not here talking about saying that only men are victims or that only men should be cared about. I don't think anybody's really in that headspace. So I think this will actually appeal to everyone and potentially build a common ground with women's rights activists. So to begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. I have an anxiety disorder and a type of social phobia that manifests very much like agoraphobia. An anxiety disorder is characterized by feelings of apprehension, uncertainty, and fear. The word is derived from the Latin, which I'm about to butcher, angre, which means to choke, throttle, strangle. Very appropriate, since that's pretty much what my phobia has done to my life for long periods of my life. For months at a time, my phobia would prevent me from actually leaving my house. And sometimes when it was really bad, I would be restricted to one room in my house. Now, what's really terrifying about a phobic attack is that it can happen at any time, anywhere, and it's often triggered by things you can't even understand intellectually afterwards. So it becomes something that you carry on your back and you don't know when it'll lash out. And reduce you to not even being able to basically just running out of whatever situation you're in. And because of that, when I was at my worst, but still able to go out in public, my life became a series of escape routes and bolt holes. Wherever I went, I could have told you exactly how to get to the nearest bathroom or alcove, the nearest exit, and the nearest place you could hide. Because every time I was moving through, I was noting the position of all of those things. Fear is more powerful and complete loss of freedom than any social or legal limitation. I could do anything legally, socially, I could do anything, do whatever I wanted. But that fear anchored me into a very small space. I'm telling you this to explain how devastating fear is. And I'm not saying that I'm the only one. I know that there are probably people in this audience who also resonate with what I'm saying, because they also experience phobia. But as bad as my phobia and panic attacks are, now that I've spent 3 years in very intensive therapy to try to deal with them, which is why I'm standing here in front of you, and I'm able to sit in front, stand in a room and tell people about my fear. As bad as clawing myself out of that abyss was, and believe me, it was an abyss, I have to confess that I'm actually thankful for my fear. And not just because of what I learned from it, but because of what it saved me from. Fear as a commodity in our society, fear is a commodity, and in our society, fear is a very valuable commodity. Specifically, women's fear is a valuable commodity. According to a, I think, very unsurprising study done during World War II by the US government, the use of women and children in danger was found to be an effective motivator for action. I'm not sure why they had to do a study on that, but they did. There you go. And this is from How to Make Posters That Will Help Win the War, Office of Facts and Figures. There you go. This rhetoric speaks to something deep inside of us. Women are vulnerable and need their men's protection. Men are not men unless they can protect women. The damsel in distress is a classic trope, and it's a classic trope because it works very well to establish motivation. We hear a woman in fear, and the need to save her. We need to save her. As a political tool, women's fear is useful for knee-jerk motivation. After Professor Drew Weston concluded his research into the true nature of political reasoning, i.e. there is no such thing, during the 2004 presidential election, he offered some very important words of wisdom to the losing Democrats. Learn from the Republican example. Republicans don't appeal to issues, they appeal to emotions. Is it a coincidence that in the 12 years since Professor Weston made his appeal to the Democrats have adopted the following rhetoric to oppose Republicans? If you're gonna go emotional, you might as well go big and go for broke. The war on women. From promoting social and legal policy like prohibition to justifying war to cutthroat partisan politics, women's fear is a very useful political weapon. And to many industries, women's fear is a valuable revenue stream because it not only motivates people to act, it also motivates people to donate. My brother is autistic. 90% of people who have autism are boys. Because of my brother, my family received materials from societies devoted to the study, care, and awareness of autism. But when I was looking through those materials related to autism, I noticed something very startling. More often than not, those groups used a girl as the face of autism. That was just one instance. Over the years, I've noticed others. When I was taking my master's in environmental design at the University of Calgary, there was an exhibition on homelessness, specifically an exhibition on homeless women. One of the assertions at the exhibition was as follows: as a minority group within the homeless population, women have needs for comfort, privacy, and safety that are currently not being served. As I looked at the materials on the situation, it occurred to me that if treating women identically to men was not providing for their comfort, privacy, and safety, then how was it providing for men's? I was then invited to support an initiative to purchase baskets of luxury items such as makeup for homeless women. Just Detention, this is one of my particular favorites. Just Detention International used to be called Stop Prison Rape. When it was Stop Prison Rape, the website included a gallery of testimonials from prisoners. Some of the men even explained that this had been the first time they'd ever been able to talk about what happened to them, was on the Stop Prison Rape site. Because they had no one to tell it to, from their friends, their family, from society, no resources, just that site. When Stop Prison Rape became Just Detention International, and apparently headed by feminist Louise Sanau, most of the stories from the male prisoners disappeared and were replaced by stories of a very specific theme. They were stories by women of having been abused by male guards. Now, if you've looked at the statistics regarding sexual abuse of prisoners in the US, you'll know that women abused by male guards is both in number and proportion the least common form of abuse. The most common form of abuse, in terms of proportion and total numbers of victims, is female staff abusing male inmates. The second most common form of abuse proportionately is female prisoners abusing each other. The third most common form of abuse is male prisoners abusing other male prisoners. And bringing up the rear is male staff abusing female prisoners. Now, there's no form of sexual abuse in prison that should be ignored, but I find it remarkable that Just Detention International purged its site of male stories in favor of focusing on the least common form of victimization. Just seems sort of improbable, just by law of averages. The least common, but coincidentally, the one that resonates best with our notion of woman as victim and man as villain. I got a dark glimpse into what was going on here. All of these initiatives finding a way to emphasize women or girls as victims and minimize men and boys, when I read a Guardian article from 2013 on the hidden victims of wartime rape. This Guardian article explored the rape of men. A recent study on sexual violence in the Congo has found that nearly as many men as women report having been subject to rape. Just as a caveat and a little bit of an aside, there's an important thing to consider when looking at that statistic. If you listen to the stories of male rape victims, they often have an addendum that women don't. The men who talk about being gang raped multiple times a day by multiple assailants tell stories of watching other prisoners, other men bleed to death from the injuries they sustained. They tell of horrendous sexual torture, such as being forced to put their genitals in acidic sap that would stick to their skin and burn into their flesh. But their addendum is usually unique to men and often went like this. Then after days, weeks, months of sexual torture, my captors would split my head open with a machete and leave me for dead in a ditch. For many of the male survivors, they didn't just survive sexual violence. The sexual violation culminated in a murder attempt. They survived, and usually they survived that against all odds. An African woman in a refugee camp once explained to an aid worker why she went out to gather supplies instead of her father, her husband, her brothers. And what she said was, "They will only rape me, they will kill them." When we look at the statistics regarding rape of men in the Congo or in any war zone, and we find that not as many rape men report it, as we have to consider that dead men don't tell tales. The Guardian article on the rape of men, moving away from that digression, went into mention very briefly one aid organization working with male victims, one of the very few that could offer them anything substantial at all. That aid organization was warned by Dutch Oxfam that if more than 30% of their resources ever went to male victims, their funding would be yanked. This you might think that this proves that sympathy for male victims and sympathy for female victims is a zero-sum game, right? And you would be wrong. It's actually worse than a zero-sum game. I recently had a short exchange with a feminist on Twitter. He insisted that Abrahamic religions were deeply misogynist. I replied that I believed they were also discriminatory towards men in various respects. And he said to me, "Why are you apologizing for them?" I was gobsmacked by that answer. Here I just said Abrahamic religions and possibly and potentially discriminated against women and men, essentially doubling the number of victims. And he said I was apologizing for them. It took me a while to untangle his thinking, but then it clicked. Using a girl's face for a disease that overwhelmingly affects boys, removing male prisoner testimonials in favor of female, how Dutch Oxfam threatened to cut its funding if a relief organization offered treatment to too many men, saying that pointing out Abrahamic faiths negatively affect men too is excusing them. When we recognize an atrocity, a crime, a calamity affects men as much as it affects women, that problem actually recedes in importance. In other words, if we have 50 female victims of an issue, and then we find out that there are also 50 male victims, we lose sympathy for all the victims. Those 50 victims aren't now having to compete with 50 male victims for resources. No. All 100 victims get 0 resources because now no one cares to give them any. Somehow our sympathy is tied to the idea that women suffer uniquely, that it is far more of injustice if something done to women because they are women, if something is done to women because they are women. The very idea triggers a sense of violation more profound than if it affects both men and women equally, even if, in the second case, there are far more victims overall. So there's a strong incentive, even an understandable incentive, for aid and relief organizations to ignore male victims, omit them from their advocacy, and quietly shuffle them out of view. And who can blame them? In our current climate, wouldn't it be better to give proper help to those 50 women, even if it means those 50 male victims get an aspirin and a shove outside the door, if they're lucky? As you can see, women's fear is a valuable commodity, as a political weapon, as a call to action, and as a sales pitch. It can be turned like a scalpel to excise subcultures dominant institutions don't like, or it can be used to justify bombing entire countries because they, quote, don't treat their women right, so let's kill them all. I think that's the sort of the extreme end of the Oxfam logic. Because women's fear is so effective in motivating a society to lose all reason in pursuit of saving women, there's even a darker side of the use of women's fear. Because the use of women's fear is behind some of the worst atrocities and systematic discriminations in human history. Unfortunately, I was going to have some slides that related to the Jim Crow and the use of extremely propaganda, the threat of white womanhood by the black men. But I was flying all today, so it didn't happen. But yeah, that's another thing. So essentially, we have used, because it's such a knee-jerk, it just turns off our mind. We can use the threat of women in peril to motivate all kinds of really nasty shit, and we have. But does the fear economy have a cost? The obvious cost is that in order to maintain the profitable illusion that only women are victims, male victims have to be ignored. Of course, I think we can all agree that women's fear can be exaggerated, even invented out of whole cloth. I highly doubt that black men possessed the threat to white Southern womanhood that was quite as bad as it was made out to be. And I don't think Jewish men presented that. I think it might have been Tad or Rublon, the threat they presented to German women. So we know governments and organizations have lied about the true scope of the threat to women. Have obvious proof of it. We have obvious proof that this was not the case. This is probably highly unlikely the case. And the same thing goes in the South during Jim Crow. It was probably highly unlikely that black men posed quite the level of threat as they were presented to. So we know that governments and organizations lie about the true scope of threat to women for their own ends. And they do it often to push unsavory or violent agendas. Now, let's consider the young African woman who explained that she'd rather gather supplies than have her male relatives go because she would just face rape and they would face murder. Do you think she would appreciate knowing that her father, brother, sons are being deliberately ignored by relief agencies when they need help? I doubt it. Treating one half of a community also does nothing to end a problem. It's like treating one half of a person's body. If the men aren't also treated for their trauma, the women in their community suffer and the cycle of abuse continues. Regardless of how good it makes us feel, treating just women ensures that problems perpetuate generation after generation. Finally, studies have shown that sociopaths have a sixth sense for picking out people who are broken by fear. Teaching a woman or women a distorted view of their own victimhood makes them afraid. It makes them adopt a posture of fear towards the world. And that makes them, ironically, more susceptible to the real predators out there. We can see the cost in human lives in exaggerating or falsifying threats to women. We can see the cost into marginalized groups of people, and we can see the cost to male victims. But there's another cost, a hidden cost. Earlier in this speech, I spoke about my experience of living with fear. I described how the word phobia is derived from the Latin angre, which means to choke, throttle, strangle, and to mispronounce horribly. And how apt a description that is for the life I lived before I had the tools to control my fear. My fear compelled me to run from opportunity, the outside world, from people, run from freedom, essentially. And it invited me to be afraid of all these things by turning innocuous situations and places into malevolent forces arrayed against me. Yet, I think my fear, as restricting, confining, and abusive as it was, saved me a worse fate. You see, when I tell people what I'm afraid of, nobody says to me, "Oh, that makes sense. You should be afraid of that." They may be sympathetic to my suffering, or they might laugh at how silly it is. But no one I have ever met has ever reinforced it. In fact, I pay for a man to tell me on regular intervals that my fear is ridiculous. Not in so many words, but yeah, there's actually, those are called therapists. They politely tell you that your fears are ridiculous. Although it's been hard to beat this fear, it can be beaten in large part because no one is reinforcing it. I can only imagine how much darker my darkest days would have been and how much longer I would have suffered them if I had the whole world telling me to be afraid. But as a woman, I have the whole world telling me to be afraid. Everywhere in the West, women are not just invited, but almost browbeaten into fearing men. I will admit I have succumbed to the compulsion to fear men. Even after having researched men's issues for a decade, I was in a back alley parking lot in a rougher area of Calgary. I had just finished a jiu-jitsu class, and I was going home to my car. Absolutely nothing happened, but I remember being afraid anyway. Being afraid that this was a perfect setup for rape. As I scurried, head down, using those furtive movements that make you so attractive to an actual predator, to my car, I had a moment of clarity. It was just like that, like an encyclopedia article just opened up in my brain and poured out its facts. And one of the facts is what I've learned researching men's issues. Most men who rape were raped themselves. In fact, the majority of men who go on to sexually abuse were themselves abused as minors by women, adult women. Not only that, but there are numerous studies suggesting now that men face significant rates of sexual abuse by women, if not equal rates. In that moment that the encyclopedia that I didn't know I had in my head opened up, I felt as if a weight I had been carrying lifted off of my shoulders. And I never until it left, I did not know that I was carrying that weight. And in its place, flooded in a confidence that I had never felt before in my life. Because I didn't have to be the victim. I think about all the opportunities I've lost because I was afraid, and all the things I didn't see and the places I didn't go, and the people I didn't trust and didn't meet because I didn't trust, the situations I didn't fully enjoy. Because instead of confidence, I had fear. Now let's imagine a doctor. Just bear with me. It's trite, but let's do it anyway. Let's call him Dr. Knight. And let's imagine Dr. Knight decided he could save women by painlessly injecting them with fear. Fear of a phobia of presumably innocuous people and situations and society. And they would otherwise regard these situations and people and societies as being completely innocuous. Oh, there we go. This is what we get to see. Name the problem, right? Okay. So regard as completely neutral. So he would take these situations, but he knew that these situations were full and fraught of peril. So it was totally justified in injecting women in fear of these situations because he knew better than them. These situations were bad situations. Now, if you met this Dr. Knight, who had done this, let's say he'd done it, not just maybe hundreds, maybe the entire population of North America, the entire female population of North America. And imagine Dr. Knight saying to you, yeah, I did this, I injected all of these women for their own good. I think you would want to have some pretty solid evidence that that was the case. In fact, I think most people, before they would even ask, would probably put him in jail and take away his medical license. Who conditions women to feel fear of innocuous things? Who takes it upon themselves to do something like that without first subjecting his research findings and to the strictest standards of evidence and outside review? In fact, if you were judging Dr. Knight's proposal right now, how much evidence would you need to say yes? Yes, let's go inject all of the women of North America with fear. That sounds like a great idea. How much evidence would you need to say yes to that? And how much evidence would you need to say no? That's stupid. First, do no harm, right? The irony is we are injecting women with toxic fear. We are inducing as devastating a phobia as the one, possibly the one I lived with for 28 years. Not in just one woman or some women, but all women. We are constantly reinforcing it as legitimate in academia and government-sponsored ad campaigns, ensuring women never escape. Because having someone saying it's totally legitimate, it's a totally legitimate fear, is a pretty good way of ensuring that you always suffer from it. No one, or very few people in the mainstream media or in academia is questioning this. No one even stops to ask, what if the statistics I'm basing this on aren't actually true? What if they're just a half-truth? Unbelievably, just like our good doctor, no one has ever had to justify creating campaigns of fear targeting women. No one has ever had to go to a review board and justify launching a campaign of fear targeting women. No one who's involved in this has ever looked at the statistics at least as hard as they looked at the statistics for women and evaluated them for men with the same weight that they do for women. And if anyone questions these campaigns of fear targeting women, what are they called?
Misogynists.
Misogynists. Love is hate, war is peace, freedom is slavery, and Dr. Knight will shoot you full of fear, and if you say anything, you're a fucking misogynist. Having lived through a life tortured by fear, it really sort of pisses me off to see people to do this to women without a second thought. But luckily, there's a cure. Yeah.
But don't stop now.
I don't. That's when my flight was. That's when we hit the tarmac, and it's like, okay, that's it. And I don't have any more time to do anything. No.
But what is the cure? What is it?
Well, obviously, looking at the statistics.
I know.
Looking at the other side, obviously the cure is
measuring
the other side, actually recognizing men's issues and talking about them and giving them the same weight as women's issues. Like if we had the statistical evidence that we have that regarding men experiencing sexually assault, that would all we need. That would be it. We would be doing campaigns if it was applied to women. That would be all we needed to do, campaigns after campaigns after campaigns. But as it is, all we do is hide it. And we just let this asymmetrical story stand. Even though it doesn't do men any favors, and it really doesn't do women any favors either. So it's the cure, in my opinion, is to be honest about the statistics. Now, and obviously I don't have necessarily a problem with saying if there's a situation where women are victims because they're women, you can say that. I just said that. I've just said that in the last, 25, 30 minutes. But if you need to be as diligent with determining that if you are wrong, that women are victims because they're women. You need to be just as diligent in determining the answer as no as yes. Or maybe something in between. Yeah.
All right, okay.
Thanks. We could do questions and answers, I suppose. Do you want to?
Yeah,
I think we should.
Yeah. I mean, we can keep presenting until they actually force us out of here. So.
Yes, let's do that.
Well, there were 3 people that had questions that didn't get to ask theirs previously.
So yeah, if those people are still around who were patiently waiting for like an hour earlier today, just go up and ask your questions.
Can I ask for questions? Does anybody have any questions for what I presented?
Yeah. Okay, there's a mic over here.
Propaganda has always been a subject that's interested me, ever since hearing about like World War II posters and all that stuff. Is there any reading material or resources where I can learn more about the actual mechanics that come?
Yeah, there probably is. Like, I don't have anything off the top of my head. I'm not like Karen. I can't rattle off citations.
CBC. No, we wanted examples of not of propaganda, but of people who study it.
Yeah, there is some there are researchers who look into that kind of stuff, and if you like leave like an email address or something, I could probably gather up some emails or some citations for you. But there are people who've looked into the mechanics of hate speech. I don't know if anybody's really looked at this in particular, like the intersection between gender, women's fear, hate speech, propaganda, and atrocity. I think that's not something that I've really seen, I've come across. But I hate to do this. You can look at some of the stuff I have at my channel. That might be enjoyable for you.
Actually, yeah, she's got some really incredible videos.
The threat narrative series, I actually reference that because of...
No, I don't like doing really long videos. I'm not like... Yeah, they have really...
They have drawings and they have puzzle pieces and they have bits and props and stuff. They're really cool.
Yeah, so if you check out Gender Addict, you can see some of that. I wish I could point you to some people who are actually exploring the use of women's fear in propaganda and actually theorizing about it, but I really... It's obvious. It seems like a very obvious thing, but I don't see a lot of people actually talking about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Now for people who've been waiting very patiently.
Hi, so this is a question potentially for all of you. How do you foresee changing the enormous influence of economics on education, specifically higher education? I say this as a grad student who's been through the humanities and seen sort of, or rather force-fed the diet of the usual flavors of what you get force-fed as a grad student, i.e. Marxism, feminism, etc. And part of the reason a lot of that sort of keeps going is just there's a lot of money behind it. Do you think that changing that would, do you think that any change of that would come as a change? Do you think that such a change would come as a result of other changes in education, or do you think it would come? Do you think that that would spur? Do you think that? Sorry, I'm mixing up my words. Do you think that would come as an effect of other change already going on? If that makes sense.
I didn't get to go through all. Crap! God, I closed it. All right. Let me. Actually, this is completely irrelevant to you. I apologize. I just an ADHD thing here. That's so long. Anyway, can you clarify your question in terms of what economics like?
Well, I just meant sort of the amount of money that's behind a lot of the academic programs, because part of the thing with like gender studies and so on is that there's a lot of enrollment in that, which is partly what keeps those programs going. And similarly, there's a lot of money behind a lot of the, special grants for particular minorities. This question sort of touches on what you guys were talking about earlier. But I think it also pertains to somewhat what you talked about, because a lot of that education is tied to really continuing on that fear that you talked about.
Well, however much money they spend on doing the same thing over and over again, it's still going to be not changing anything. So I wouldn't worry about it. Well, but that's my opinion.
Well, I actually think that it can't last forever, because money is not infinite. And the way things are going is just it's not going to be sustainable to push that much money constantly into something that really has no economic payoff. Okay, so we got a bunch of really bitchy baristas now, okay, but they're all making minimum wage, and it's really not. I mean, like, how can you justify it when there are veterans who need care who aren't getting it, when there are senior citizens who are struggling, when there are young people who cannot afford to who will never be able to afford to retire, given the way the system's going? How can you justify and then charging these kids to be, oh my God, it's a crime. It's a fucking crime. Sorry, it is, and it can't last, because eventually the money's going to run out. Eventually the tuitions are going to go up so high that, especially in the States, that there's no amount, and student loans aren't fungible in a bankruptcy. So these kids are going to be left with debts that they can't pay off, with a piece of paper that's worthless. So I mean, it can't go on forever. It can't.
Can I recommend, maybe somebody can back me up, there's a book that a woman wrote who's a professor, and she's actually, like, I think she considers herself a feminist, although she's not so much in the SJW crowd. She wrote a book called, I don't remember if Aristotle's Middle Finger or Galileo's Middle Finger, that touches a lot on the issues with, apparently, where the funding is coming from for these universities, and why the monetization is causing this sort of polarization.
Okay, cool.
Galileo's Middle Finger.
Now, I got a couple of things to say about this. I come from a family of educators, and there are two things that universities are doing that I think are essentially a crime. They may not be a crime in terms of law, but they're a crime in terms of the result. One of them is they are encouraging students to go for degrees that are not going to help them earn a living when they get out. And they're doing it because the government will pay them to do it. And the only way to change that is to make the funding dependent on that specific characteristic. If the degree is going to be useless for the student, if the student is not going to be able to pay the loan off, if the student is not going to be able to go out and get a sustaining job because of that degree, the government shouldn't pay the university to give that student that degree. You can do things that are your hobby on your own. You can pay for your hobby yourself. If all of your educational efforts are going into a hobby, and if you're not earning money from it, if you're not able to earn money from it, that's what it is. They're just like the difference between what makes you a professional photographer and an amateur. If somebody pays you to do it, you could be a better photographer than people who are getting paid to do it and not be considered a professional. If you're going into philosophy, if you're going into underwater basket weaving, if you're going into 14th century French poetry, if somebody's not going to pay you to do that, then why should my tax dollars, or Alison's tax dollars, or Karen's tax dollars, or Theron's tax dollars go to fund that, knowing that you're not going to be able to pay back the loan? If I went to a bank and I asked for a loan to go do something that I was going to default on, and there was a good chance I was going to default on it, by asking them to keep extending, I don't have to pay you over and over again, they would laugh me out of there. Why are we doing it to students? That's the first thing. The second thing about money involved in this is there needs to be transparency regarding the money that goes into what curriculum gets placed in your school. You look at the history of women's studies, you will actually see a lot of big money. Yeah. The one that comes to mind first is the Ford Foundation.
Rockefeller too.
Rockefeller.
Why?
Yep.
Why would they want to spend money on that?
I don't know.
Why would they want to spend money on that?
You know, you got to start looking into stuff like that. And without the general public being aware of that, they think that the expansion of feminism into academia, and then feminist academia from a single class into an entire major was a struggle. It wasn't a struggle. It was a Monty Hall. And this is an entirely different story than what the public gets. And I don't think that the changes would be viewed the same. I don't think that women's studies in general would be viewed nearly the same if most people knew how it was bankrolled.
Yeah.
So there needs to be complete transparency.
You mean they weren't the underdogs?
There needs to be complete transparency into that. Into the funding that goes into what ends up in your curriculum. Who's paying to tell you as a student that something is fact? You have a right to know that. You have a right to know if you're being told something because somebody paid for you to be told that, as opposed to if you're being told something because it was discovered to be true. So that's my two things.
Can I, if I can remember, I wanted to take off of what you said. I think that there is a economic incentive. It might be roundabout, but I think it creates a climate in which a lot of this stuff flourishes. Yeah. So building up women's vulnerability, building up women's victimhood, creates a climate, knee-jerk climate of extremely emotional reacting to, yeah, like look at what the Democrats did. And I'm not actually, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. I'm agnostic on politics as a whole. But look at what the Democrats did. They were advised, you gotta be more emotional. Yeah. War on women. Yeah. It's valuable because it turns brains off. It just completely, they went from 0 to 60. Like they just went from, that's like going, just being straight and then going right to smack. Just mainlining Carol,
yeah.
And not even going through marijuana, just right to.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
we're being kicked out.
Yeah, we've run out of time. And that gentleman over there with the question, I invite you to just, when everyone's outside, come chat with these ladies and
okay,
chat with me.
Before we go, I just wanted to say one thing really quickly. I think circumcision is bad. I think it shouldn't be done. I'm not sure how we got to a point as a society society where scalpels and babies' genitals were two things that, yeah, those are two things that should go together. Yeah, let's get on that. Let's get right there. Let's do that
It wasn't
thing.
even scalpels, it was like a sharp rock.
Oh God!
Sorry.
Or a moil
Before you guys leave, just shut up. I just
Shut up.
I can't end this event without thanking everyone that needs to be thanked. Firstly, all of you guys, thank you so much for coming, and we really, really appreciate the support, and we see our numbers growing, and it's encouraging us to continue doing what we do. And I was told to promote the donation jar outside. So,
Give us all your money.
Yeah.
Give us your shekels.
And then secondly, the wonderful speakers, the panelists, they deserve another round of applause. And then lastly, those most important to me personally, my wonderful team who have been working so hard. Let me just tell you, you do not want a trans woman who is on her 4th month of hormone therapy as your boss, because it's like having a teenager as your boss sometimes. And I appreciate you guys for having so much patience with me. Let me tell you. Thank you so much for what you're doing, Jessie, our Vice President. Please give her round of applause. Gigi, our Treasurer. Emma, our Secretary. And Phil, our advisor on play. I don't know where he is.
Our overlord.
Our overlord, yes. Anyway, thank you so much.